Logan drove ice roads for 12 years, knew every mile of Alaska's deadliest highway. But that February night, something followed his truck through a blizzard at minus 60 degrees, massive shapes keeping pace in the whiteout. His final radio call. Eliza. It's walking upright. It's hurting me somewhere. They found his truck the next morning. Engine running, door open, Logan gone forever. What would you do if you were driving alone on America's most dangerous road and realized something was following your truck through a 3-day blizzard? By the time I figured out what was happening, it was already too late to turn back. My name is Logan Mitchell. I'm 34 years old and I've been hauling freight on Alaska's ice roads for the past 12 years. I live in a small cabin about 20 miles outside Fairbanks, and until 3 months ago, I thought I'd seen everything the last frontier could throw at a man. I was wrong. The Dalton Highway, locals call it the Hall Road, stretches 414 miles from Fairbanks north to Deadhorse, cutting through some of the most unforgiving wilderness on Earth. It's the only road that reaches the Arctic Ocean, and during winter, it becomes a lifeline for the oil operations at Prudhoe Bay. I've made that run hundreds of times, through blizzards that would terrify most people, in temperatures that can drop to 70 below zero. The isolation doesn't bother me anymore, or at least it didn't until that February run. I remember checking the weather forecast before loading up my Kenworth at the Fairbanks depot. The National Weather Service was calling for heavy snow and high winds, with temperatures dropping to minus 60. Nothing I hadn't handled before. My dispatcher, Eliza, a tough woman in her 50s, who'd been coordinating ice road runs since before I got my CDL, gave me the usual warnings about fuel gel and keeping my engine block heater plugged in during mandatory rest stops. "Logan, you sure you want to take this one?" she asked, watching the weather radar on her computer screen. "This storm's looking nasty, even for up there." I told her I'd driven through worse, which was true. What I didn't know was that this storm would be different. Not because of the weather, but because of what was moving through it. The first day went smoothly enough. I left Fairbanks at 4 a.m, hauling drilling equipment and supplies for the North Slope operations. The highway was empty, except for the occasional southbound trucker heading back to civilization. By the time I reached Coldfoot, the tiny truck stop that serves as the halfway point to nowhere, the snow was coming down harder, and the wind was picking up. I grabbed coffee and checked my load straps, then pushed on toward Adigan Pass. That's when things started feeling wrong. It began around mile marker 250, just south of the Brooks Range. The blizzard had intensified to the point where my headlights could barely penetrate more than 20 feet ahead. I was crawling along at maybe 15 miles per hour, following the reflective markers that were my only guide through the whiteout. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour. Solar storm activity was interfering with communications, which wasn't unusual that far north. I first noticed the tracks around 10 p.m., during one of those brief moments when the wind died down and visibility improved slightly. They were running parallel to the road, maybe 50 yards to the east, cutting through the deep snow in a straight line that matched my speed perfectly. At first glance, they looked like they could belong to a caribou or maybe a wolf pack, but something about them felt off. They were too large, too evenly spaced, and they maintained that perfect parallel course for miles without deviating. The smart thing would have been to stop and investigate, but stopping on the Dalton Highway in a blizzard at 60 below is essentially suicide. Your engine can freeze solid in 20 minutes, and if that happens, you're looking at a slow, cold death in one of the most isolated places on Earth. So I kept driving, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks in the storm. By midnight, I was somewhere north of Adigan Pass, descending into the endless flatlands that stretch toward the Arctic Ocean. The tracks were still there, still perfectly parallel to my route. But now I was seeing something else in my peripheral vision. Dark shapes moving through the storm, keeping pace with my truck despite the treacherous conditions. I tried raising Eliza on the radio, but all I got was static, punctuated by the occasional burst of garbled transmission from somewhere far away. The GPS was working, showing my position as a lonely blue dot creeping across a vast expanse of white nothing. According to the display, the nearest settlement was Dead Horse, still over 100 miles north. That's when I started to understand that whatever was out there wasn't random wildlife. It was following me deliberately. Around 2 a.m., my headlights caught something that made my blood freeze. During a momentary break in the snow, I saw a figure standing upright about 100 yards ahead, just off the shoulder of the road. It was tall, taller than any human, and seemed to be watching my approach. As I got closer, it melted back into the storm, but not before I caught a glimpse of something that defied everything I thought I knew about Alaska's wildlife. It was bipedal, walking on 2 legs like a person, but wrong in every other way. I floored the accelerator as much as I dared on the icy surface, my heart hammering against my ribs. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a person in heavy winter gear. Maybe it was a trick of the headlights and blowing snow. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't human. The next few hours became a nightmare of cat and mouse through the frozen darkness. Whatever was out, there had multiplied. I could see at least 3 distinct shapes moving through the storm, coordinating their movements like a pack of predators. They stayed just outside the reach of my headlights, but I could sense them pacing my truck, sometimes on one side of the road, sometimes on both. The worst part was realizing they were hurting me. Every time I tried to slow down or deviate from the main road, they would appear directly ahead, forcing me to maintain course and speed. They were driving me towards something, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it except keep moving forward into whatever trap they were setting. Around 4 a.m., my fuel gauge started dropping faster than it should have. I pulled over to check my tanks and discovered that my auxiliary fuel line had been severed. Not damaged by weather or wear, but cut clean through. While I was under the truck with my flashlight, I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up, footsteps in the snow, circling my rig. Big, heavy footsteps that crunched through the frozen surface with the weight of something massive. I scrambled back into the cab and locked the doors, knowing how ridiculous that was, but unable to help myself. Through the windshield, I could see shapes moving in the storm, tall figures that seemed to glide rather than walk, positioned around my truck like sentinels. They were waiting for something. That's when I managed to get through to Eliza on the radio. "Dispatch, this is Logan, come in." "Logan, Jesus, where the hell are you? I've been trying to raise you for hours." "Eliza, listen to me carefully. Something's wrong up here. There's something in the storm, something following me. They cut my fuel line. I'm trapped about 60 miles south of Dead Horse." There was a long pause. "Logan, you're breaking up. Did you say someone cut your fuel line?" "Not someone. Something. Eliza, they're not human. They're walking upright, but they're not. Oh, God, one of them is approaching the truck." Through the driver's side window, I could see a figure emerging from the blizzard. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur or hair, with arms that hung down past where its knees should be. But the face, what I could see of it in the reflected glow of my headlights, was the stuff of nightmares. Intelligent eyes that reflected light like an animal's, but with a calculating awareness that no animal should possess. "Eliza, it's looking right at me. It knows I can see it. They're not trying to hide anymore. Logan, you need to get out of there. Start your engine and drive." "I can't. They're surrounding the truck. There's at least 4 of them now, maybe more." The creature closest to my window raised one massive hand and placed it against the glass. Its fingers were too long, ending in claws that scratched against the surface. It tilted its head, studying me with those terrible, intelligent eyes. Logan, come in. Eliza, if something happens, To me, tell my sister I'm sorry I never made it back for Christmas like I promised. And tell the company to stay off this stretch of road until someone figures out what's living up here. That was my last transmission. The radio went dead, and the creatures closed in. I woke up 18 hours later in a hospital bed in Fairbanks, with no memory of how I got there. They told me a search helicopter found me walking along the highway, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. My truck was discovered 3 miles away, abandoned with the engine still running and the driver's door hanging open. The cargo was untouched, but every electronic device in the cab had been destroyed, crushed as if by enormous hands. The official report blamed the incident on hallucinations brought on by carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty exhaust system. But I know what I saw that night. And I know that whatever's living in Alaska's frozen wilderness is still out there, waiting for the next lone traveler to venture too far into their territory. I don't drive the ice roads anymore. I thought I understood the northern lights after studying them for 3 years. But during my month alone at a remote Arctic research station, the aurora began responding to my thoughts. When I realized the lights weren't just displaying impossible colors and patterns, but were actually communicating with me, it was already too late to leave. My name is Serenity. I'm 26 years old, and I'm a graduate student in atmospheric physics at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I live in a small apartment near campus, and I thought I understood everything there was to know about the aurora borealis until I spent 31 days alone at the Poker Flat Research Range, 30 miles northeast of Fairbanks. What I experienced there changed not just my understanding of the northern lights, but my entire perception of what's possible in our universe. The Poker Flat Research Range sits in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by boreal forest and rolling hills that stretch endlessly in every direction. It's one of the most isolated research facilities in North America, established specifically because light pollution and electromagnetic interference are virtually non-existent. During the winter months, it becomes the perfect laboratory for studying aurora activity during the peak of solar maximum cycles. I had applied for the solo observation position as part of my doctoral research on electromagnetic anomalies in aurora displays. The position required staying alone at the remote station for 31 days during December and January, the peak of Alaska's polar night period, when darkness lasts nearly 20 hours each day. Most graduate students wouldn't even consider such an assignment. The isolation can be psychologically devastating, and the nearest human contact is a 40-minute snowmobile ride through treacherous terrain. But I was different. I had always been comfortable with solitude, and I was fascinated by the opportunity to observe the aurora without any external distractions. My research focused on unusual electromagnetic signatures that occasionally appeared in aurora displays, patterns that didn't match any known solar-wind interactions. I thought spending a month in complete isolation would give me the uninterrupted observation time I needed to document these anomalies properly. The station itself was essentially a winterized cabin equipped with sophisticated monitoring equipment, generators for power, and enough supplies to last 6 weeks. The observation deck was built on the roof, accessed by a ladder that froze solid within hours of sunset each day. Radio contact with the university was scheduled every 48 hours, and emergency communication was available via satellite phone. For the first week, everything went according to plan. The aurora activity was spectacular. Ribbons of green and blue light dancing across the star-filled sky in patterns that took my breath away. I documented normal geomagnetic readings and photographed the displays using time-lapse equipment. The isolation didn't bother me. If anything, I found the complete silence and darkness between aurora events deeply peaceful. The first anomaly occurred on December 15th, during what should have been a routine moderate-level aurora display. I was on the observation deck, recording electromagnetic readings, when I noticed something impossible. The aurora was forming geometric patterns. Not the usual flowing curtains of light, but perfect triangles and hexagons that pulsed in synchronization with my heartbeat. I initially dismissed it as sleep deprivation. I'd been maintaining an irregular schedule, staying awake during the darkest hours to maximize observation time and sleeping fitfully during the brief periods of twilight. But when I checked my equipment readings, the electromagnetic signatures were unlike anything in the scientific literature. The frequencies were too organized, too deliberately structured to be natural phenomena. Over the next several nights, the patterns became more complex and more obviously intentional. The aurora would form spirals that rotated in perfect mathematical sequences, or create grid patterns that resembled circuit boards sprawling across the entire sky. Most disturbing of all, the lights seemed to respond to my presence. When I moved to different positions on the observation deck, the aurora would shift and refocus, as if tracking my movements. By December 20th, I was experiencing severe sleep deprivation and vitamin D deficiency from the constant darkness. My radio check-ins with the university became increasingly difficult as I struggled to explain what I was observing without sounding completely unhinged. How do you tell your thesis advisor that the northern lights are displaying what appears to be intelligent behavior? The breaking point came on the winter solstice during the longest night of the year. The aurora activity that evening was beyond anything I had ever witnessed, not just in intensity, but in its obvious artificial nature. The lights formed symbols that resembled ancient writing systems, scrolling across the sky in sequences that suggested language or mathematical equations. Colors appeared that shouldn't exist in natural aurora displays, deep purples and silver that hurt my eyes to look at directly. Then the lights began projecting images. At first, they were simple geometric shapes that moved and transformed across the sky like a massive three-dimensional movie screen. But gradually, the images became more complex and more terrifying. I saw landscapes that weren't terrestrial, alien vistas under foreign stars, cities that defied physics, and creatures that moved through impossible architectures. The most horrifying realization was that the aurora wasn't just showing me these things randomly. It was responding to my thoughts, displaying images that corresponded to my fears and curiosities. When I wondered what lay beyond our solar system, the lights showed me vast networks of civilizations connected by streams of energy that looked exactly like aurora displays. When I thought about the isolation of the research station, the lights revealed that I wasn't alone. There were watchers in the darkness, entities that existed in the electromagnetic spectrum and used aurora phenomena to observe our world. The final image nearly drove me to complete madness. The aurora formed a perfect map of Earth, as seen from space, but with streams of light connecting every location where aurora displays occur. The entire planet was networked by these electromagnetic phenomena, and suddenly I understood that what we call the northern and southern lights aren't natural atmospheric events at all. They're a communication system, a way for something vast and alien to monitor and interact with our planet. On December 23rd, during what should have been my routine radio check-in, I tried to explain to my advisor what I had discovered. I described the geometric patterns, the impossible colors, the responsive behavior of the aurora displays. There was a long silence before he suggested I might be experiencing hallucinations brought on by isolation and sleep deprivation. He recommended I abort the study and return to Fairbanks immediately. But I couldn't leave. The aurora had become addictive. Every night brought new revelations, new images from beyond our world, new evidence that humanity wasn't alone in the universe. The lights were teaching me things about physics and cosmic structures that wouldn't be discovered by conventional science for centuries. I was receiving knowledge directly from entities that existed on scales we couldn't comprehend. The last entry in my research journal, dated December 30th, consisted of a single sentence repeated hundreds of times in handwriting that became increasingly erratic. They know I know they know I know. I was found on January 2nd by a search team from the university, suffering from severe hypothermia and malnutrition. I was discovered outside the station, lying in the snow and staring up at the dark sky despite the fact that there was no aurora activity that night. My observation equipment had been systematically destroyed, and every piece of recorded data from my month at the station had been wiped clean. The official explanation was that I had suffered a complete psychological breakdown, brought on by isolation, seasonal affective disorder, and sleep deprivation. I was hospitalized for 2 weeks and underwent extensive psychological evaluation before being cleared to return to my studies. But I know what I saw during those 31 nights. The aurora borealis isn't a natural phenomenon. It's a window into something far more vast and terrifying than we could ever imagine. And now, whenever I see those lights dancing across Alaska's winter sky, I know they're watching me back, waiting for the right moment to show me more than any human mind was meant to comprehend. I changed my doctoral focus to theoretical mathematics. I can't study the aurora anymore without remembering what it showed me about our place in the universe. I've been logging Alaska's forests for 15 years, and I thought I knew every creature that lived in these ancient woods. But when my crew started finding equipment destroyed by something with claws longer than bear tracks and intelligence far beyond any animal, I realized we had invaded territory that belonged to something much older and more dangerous than anything in the wildlife guides. My name is Aiden. I'm 29 years old, and I've been working as a logging foreman for Alaska Timber Solutions out of Kodiak for the past 6 years. I live in a small house on the outskirts of Kodiak City, right where the pavement ends and the wilderness begins. What happened to me and my crew last October in the remote interior of Kodiak Island will haunt me for the rest of my life. And it's the reason I'll never set foot in an untouched forest again. Kodiak Island is massive, over 3,500 square miles of mostly uninhabited wilderness, dominated by towering Sitka spruce forests that have been growing undisturbed for thousands of years. The interior of the island is a maze of mountains, valleys, and dense forest corridors where humans rarely venture. Most logging operations stick to the accessible coastal areas, but last fall, we were contracted to harvest a specific tract of old-growth timber in the island's mountainous heart, trees so ancient and valuable that the company was willing to helicopter in equipment and establish a temporary camp in an area with no roads or settlements within 100 miles. The job was supposed to take 2 weeks. We had a crew of 5 experienced loggers, all men who had worked Alaska's forests for decades. Besides myself, there was Margaret, our equipment operator, and the only woman on the crew, a tough, no-nonsense professional who could handle machinery better than most men twice her size. The others were experienced locals who knew Kodiak's terrain and wildlife patterns better than anyone. We flew in on October 3rd, when the autumn weather was still stable enough for helicopter operations. The pilot dropped us and our equipment at a small clearing about 60 miles inland from Kodiak City, surrounded by Sitka spruce trees that stretched over 200 feet into the gray sky. Some of these giants were easily 400 years old, with trunks so massive it would take 6 people holding hands to encircle them. The forest felt different from other logging sites I'd worked. There was an oppressive quality to the silence, not the peaceful quiet of a normal woodland, but a heavy, watching stillness that made conversation feel like an intrusion. The trees were so densely packed that even during the day, very little sunlight reached the forest floor. Fog rolled in constantly from the Pacific, creating a perpetual twilight atmosphere that muffled sound and limited visibility to maybe 50 yards in any direction. Our first few days went smoothly. We established base camp in the clearing and began the process of identifying and marking the trees designated for harvest. The old-growth Sitka spruce in this area were incredibly valuable, straight-grain timber that would be used for specialty construction projects. We set up our equipment and began the careful process of felling these ancient giants according to sustainable forestry practices. But on the fourth day, we found our first piece of damaged equipment. Margaret discovered it when she went to start up the delimbing machine. The hydraulic arm had been twisted into an impossible position, bent completely backward, as if something with enormous strength had grabbed it and wrenched it around. The metal showed deep gouges that looked like claw marks, but they were far too large and too deep to have been made by any known animal on Kodiak Island. "Bears don't do this kind of damage," Margaret said, running her fingers along the gouges in the steel. "Even the biggest brown bear couldn't generate enough force to twist hydraulic equipment like this." I examined the damage myself and had to agree. Kodiak brown bears are the largest bears in the world, some weighing over 1,500 pounds, but the claw marks on our equipment were at least twice the size of anything a bear could produce. More disturbing was the precision of the damage. It wasn't random destruction, but seemed deliberately targeted to disable the machinery without destroying it completely. We reported the incident to the main office via satellite phone, but they told us equipment malfunctions weren't unusual in remote locations and to continue with the operation. What else could we do? We had a job to complete and a helicopter pickup scheduled for October 17th. The second incident occurred 3 days later. Margaret had been operating the feller buncher, cutting trees in a sector about a quarter mile from base camp. She radioed in around noon to report that something was wrong with the hydraulics, and when I hiked over to check on her, I found the massive machine completely disabled, but this time the damage was even more disturbing. The steel cutting head had been removed entirely, not broken off but carefully detached and placed on the ground nearby. The hydraulic lines had been disconnected with what appeared to be surgical precision. Most terrifying of all, there were massive footprints in the soft earth around the machine, bipedal tracks that measured over 18 inches long and showed clear evidence of opposable thumbs. "Aiden, what the hell could do this?" Margaret asked, her usual confidence shaken. "This isn't animal behavior. Animals don't disassemble machinery." I didn't have an answer. The footprints were unlike anything in my 15 years of forest work. They were clearly from something that walked upright on 2 legs, but the size and proportions were all wrong for a human being. The stride length suggested something at least 8 feet tall, and the depth of the impressions indicated a weight of several hundred pounds. That night, we heard the sounds for the first time. It started around midnight. A low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Not quite a roar, not quite a howl, but something in between that resonated through the forest with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. The sound lasted for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. "Did you guys hear that?" whispered one of the crew. We all had, and we all knew instinctively that whatever had made that sound was aware of our presence and was trying to communicate something to us. Whether it was a warning, a threat, or something else entirely, none of us could sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, we found trees around our camp marked with claw scratches at a height of at least 10 feet off the ground. The marks were fresh, made some time during the night while we huddled in our tents listening to those impossible vocalizations. The message was clear. We were being watched, and whatever was watching us wanted us to know it. I made the decision to continue working, but with new safety protocols. Nobody worked alone. Everyone carried emergency radios, and we established regular check-in times every 30 minutes. But the incidents escalated. Equipment continued to be damaged in increasingly sophisticated ways. Tools would be moved and arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. We would find our chainsaws disassembled with every component carefully laid out in geometric arrangements. Fuel containers would be emptied but not damaged, their contents poured out in perfect circles around trees we had marked for cutting. The breaking point came on October 13th, 4 days before our scheduled extraction. Margaret was working with 2 other crew members on a particularly large Sitka spruce about half a mile from camp. I was back at base, coordinating with our helicopter pilot about the pickup schedule, when I heard Margaret's voice crackle over the radio. "Aiden, we need help over here. Something's wrong." Her transmission cut off abruptly. I tried to raise her on the radio multiple times but got no response. I grabbed my emergency kit and hiked as fast as I could through the dense forest toward their last known position, following the sound of chainsaws that had suddenly gone silent. I found the worksite abandoned. The chainsaw was lying on the ground, still warm, but turned off. The tree they had been cutting showed a clean cut about halfway through the massive trunk, but the work had stopped abruptly. There were signs of a struggle in the soft earth, boot prints from my crew members, and those impossibly large bipedal tracks that we had been finding around our damaged equipment. But Margaret and the 2 crew members were gone. I searched the area for over an hour, calling their names and following various tracks through the underbrush. The forest seemed to swallow sound. My voice carried maybe 20 yards before being absorbed by the dense vegetation and perpetual fog. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of settling wood and the distant sound of waves against Kodiak's coastline. I finally found Margaret's radio about 200 yards from the worksite, smashed beyond repair and hanging from a tree branch at least 12 feet off the ground. Below it, scratched into the bark of the ancient Sitka spruce, was a message that made my blood freeze. 3 parallel claw marks, each over a foot long, carved deep into the living wood. I returned to base camp and immediately called for emergency extraction. The helicopter pilot initially refused, saying weather conditions were deteriorating, and he couldn't guarantee a safe landing until the scheduled pickup date. But when I explained that 3 crew members were missing, and we had evidence of hostile wildlife, he agreed to attempt an emergency evacuation the following morning. That final night in the forest was the longest of my life. I sat in my tent with a loaded rifle, listening to sounds that seemed to circle our camp in coordinated patterns. Multiple vocalizations from different directions moving in ways that suggested communication and planning. Whatever was out there knew I was alone, and it was deciding what to do about it. The helicopter found me at first light, huddled in the clearing with my gear packed and ready. As we lifted off and gained altitude, I looked down at the forest canopy and saw something that will haunt me forever. 3 figures standing in a small clearing about a mile from our camp, looking up at the helicopter. They were too tall to be human, covered in dark hair or fur, and they stood perfectly still as we flew away, watching until we disappeared over the mountains. Margaret and the other 2 crew members were never found. The official investigation concluded that they had become lost in the dense forest and succumbed to exposure, despite the fact that all 3 were experienced woodsmen who knew Kodiak's terrain intimately. The damaged equipment was attributed to brown bear activity, and the unusual footprints were dismissed as hoax evidence or misidentified bear tracks. But I know what happened to my crew that October. Something ancient and intelligent lives in Kodiak's old-growth forests. Something that has been there far longer than humans have walked this continent. We invaded its territory, and it defended itself the only way it knew how. I still work in the logging industry, but only on previously harvested land or forest edges near human settlements. I'll never venture into untouched wilderness again, because I know now that some places were never meant for human intrusion. I was hired to assess an abandoned Alaskan village for potential tourism development. But when I discovered the original residents didn't leave by choice in 1949, I realized some places are abandoned for reasons that still walk among the empty houses. By the time I understood what had driven an entire community to flee their ancestral home, it was already watching me from the tree line, and I was 70 miles from the nearest living soul. My name is Eva Carter. I'm 38 years old, and I work as an urban planning consultant based out of Anchorage. I specialize in historic preservation and community development projects throughout Alaska, helping small towns and native corporations assess properties for cultural tourism and economic development. Last March, I accepted what seemed like a routine contract to evaluate the abandoned village of Portlock on the Kenai Peninsula for potential redevelopment. What I discovered there changed everything I thought I knew about Alaska's forgotten communities and why some places should remain forgotten. Portlock sits on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula, accessible only by boat or float plane depending on weather and tidal conditions. The village was established in the 1920s as a cannery and logging community, built around a natural harbor that provided shelter from the brutal storms that regularly sweep across the Gulf of Alaska. At its peak, Portlock housed nearly 200 residents, fishermen, cannery workers, loggers, and their families, who carved out a living from one of Alaska's most unforgiving coastlines. But in 1949, every single resident abandoned Portlock within a matter of weeks, leaving behind homes, businesses, and personal belongings as if they had fled in panic. The official records simply state that the community disbanded due to economic factors and wildlife encounters, but no government agency or historical society had ever conducted a thorough investigation of what actually happened. That's where I came in. The Kenai Peninsula Borough had been approached by a development company interested in transforming Portlock into a heritage tourism destination, capitalizing on Alaska's growing interest in ghost towns and abandoned settlements. My job was to assess the structural integrity of the remaining buildings, document the historical significance of the site, and provide recommendations for potential restoration or development. I flew into Portlock on March 15th with my research assistant Grayson, a recent graduate in architectural history who specialized in documenting historic structures. The float plane pilot, a weathered bush pilot named Jake, who had been flying Alaska's coast for 30 years, seemed unusually reluctant to land at Portlock's small harbor. "You sure you folks want me to leave you here for 3 days?" he asked as we circled the abandoned village. "This place has always given me the creeps. I've been flying over Portlock for decades, and I've never seen so much as a seagull land there. Even the wildlife avoids this place." From the air, Portlock looked like any other abandoned Alaskan settlement, weathered buildings slowly being reclaimed by the coastal forest, rusted equipment scattered around the old cannery, docks partially collapsed into the harbor. But there was something unsettling about the uniformity of the abandonment. Usually, ghost towns show signs of gradual decline. Some buildings maintained longer than others, evidence of people leaving over months or years. Portlock looked like everyone had left simultaneously, in the middle of their daily routines. We landed in the harbor, and Jake helped us unload our equipment, cameras, measuring tools, ground-penetrating radar for assessing foundations, and camping gear for our planned 3-day survey. As the float plane taxied away and lifted off, leaving us alone in the abandoned village, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March weather. The silence was the first thing I noticed. Not the normal quiet of a remote location, but a complete absence of sound that seemed unnatural. No bird calls, no insects, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Even the waves lapping against the collapsed dock seemed muted, as if the sound was being absorbed by something in the environment. We began our survey with the most intact structures near the harbor. The buildings were in remarkably good condition considering they had been abandoned for over 70 years. Alaska's dry climate and the remoteness of the location had protected them from vandalism and excessive weathering. But as we explored the interiors, we found evidence that the evacuation had been sudden and panicked. In the first house we examined, the kitchen table was still set for breakfast, with plates and utensils arranged as if the family had been interrupted mid-meal. A child's coat hung on a hook by the door, and toys were scattered across the living room floor. In the bedroom, dresser drawers had been pulled out and emptied hastily, with clothing scattered around, as if someone had been packing in desperate hurry. "Ava, look at this," Grayson called from the back bedroom. He was standing next to a window that faced the forest behind the village. The glass was intact, but it was covered in scratches, deep gouges that formed parallel lines across the entire surface. "These scratches are on the outside of the glass. Something was trying to get in." I examined the window more closely and felt my stomach drop. The scratches weren't random. They formed a deliberate pattern of parallel lines that looked disturbingly like claw marks. But they were far too large and too high on the window to have been made by any normal animal. Whatever had made these marks would have needed to be at least 8 feet tall and possessed claws longer than a bear's. We found similar evidence in every building we examined. Windows scratched from the outside, doors that had been barricaded from within using furniture and boards, and in several houses, holes punched through exterior walls with such force that the wooden planking had splintered outward. Most disturbing of all, we discovered what appeared to be a hastily constructed fortification at the center of the village. A circular barricade made from overturned tables, mattresses, and scrap lumber, as if the entire community had made a final stand in the village square. On our second day, while documenting the old cannery building, Grayson found a collection of journals and newspapers that had been preserved in a metal filing cabinet. The papers were from 1948 and early 1949, and they told a story that made my hands shake as I read. The troubles had started in late 1948, according to the journal entries written by what appeared to be the village postmaster. Residents reported seeing something large moving through the forest around Portlock, something that walked upright like a man but was far too big to be human. Trappers found their equipment destroyed and their trap lines disturbed by something with enormous hands and incredible strength. By early 1949, the encounters had escalated. The journal described livestock being killed in ways that didn't match any known predator patterns. Dogs refused to venture beyond the village boundaries and would howl incessantly during the night. Several residents reported finding massive footprints around their homes, bipedal tracks that measured over 20 inches long and showed evidence of opposable thumbs. The final journal entry, dated March 1949, was barely legible and written in what appeared to be extreme agitation. "It took the Anderson boy last night. Pulled him right out of his bedroom window. We found tracks leading into the forest, but no sign of little Tommy. The thing is getting bolder. It knows we're trapped here until the supply boat comes. God help us all." That evening, as we sat in our tent reviewing the documentation we had gathered, Grayson made a discovery that chilled me to the bone. He had been examining photographs of the scratched windows when he noticed something in the background of one image, a dark shape visible among the trees behind the village. "Ava, look at this photo I took of the schoolhouse window. Do you see that shadow between the trees?" I looked at the image on his camera's LCD screen and felt every hair on my body stand up. There, partially concealed behind a large spruce tree about 100 yards from the village, was the unmistakable silhouette of something massive and bipedal. It appeared to be watching us, and the photograph clearly showed it standing upright, on 2 legs, with arms that hung down past where its knees should be. "When did you take this picture?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "About 2 hours ago, while you were measuring the cannery foundation. I was just documenting the exterior damage to the school building. I realized that whatever had driven the residents of Portlock away in 1949 was still there, still watching from the forest that surrounded the abandoned village. We had been observed from the moment we arrived, and now it was making itself known. That night, we heard the sounds that the journal had described, low, rumbling vocalizations that seemed to come from multiple directions around the village. They weren't quite animal sounds, but they weren't human either. There was an intelligence behind them, a deliberate quality that suggested communication or coordination. Around midnight, something began testing the perimeter of our camp. We could hear heavy footsteps circling our tent, staying just outside the range of our flashlights. Occasionally, we would see shadows moving past the tent walls, shapes too large and too upright to be natural wildlife. The final encounter came just before dawn. I was awakened by the sound of something breathing heavily just outside the tent wall near my head. The breathing was deep and deliberate, and I could feel warm air moving through the thin nylon fabric. Whatever was out there was inches away from me, separated only by the tent wall, and it was studying me with the same scientific curiosity that I had been applying to its abandoned village. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the entity completed its examination. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the presence withdrew, and I heard heavy footsteps moving away toward the forest. At first light, we packed our equipment with shaking hands and activated our emergency beacon to call for immediate extraction. Jake arrived within 2 hours, and as we loaded our gear into the float plane, I looked back at Portlock one final time. Standing at the edge of the tree line, partially concealed but clearly visible, was a figure that towered over the surrounding vegetation. It stood perfectly still, watching us leave, and I knew with absolute certainty that it had allowed us to survive our 3 days in its territory as a warning to others. The development project was immediately canceled after I submitted my report. I recommended that Portlock be designated as a protected archaeological site with restricted access, citing unstable structures and dangerous wildlife activity. But I know the real reason that village should remain abandoned. Some places in Alaska are empty because they belong to something else, something that was here long before humans arrived and will be here long after we're gone. Portlock isn't a ghost town. It's a monument to the hubris of thinking we can claim any piece of this vast, wild territory without consequences. I still work as a planning consultant, but I'll never again venture into Alaska's truly remote areas without wondering what might be watching me from the darkness between the trees. If these stories from Alaska's frozen wilderness have left you questioning what else might be lurking in the last frontier's endless darkness, then you're ready to join our growing family here at Verified Souls. This is just the beginning of our journey into the unexplained and terrifying corners of our world. And I need subscribers like you who understand that some stories are too important to ignore. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because together we're going to uncover the truth behind the mysteries that others are too afraid to investigate. Welcome to Verified Souls, where every story brings us closer to understanding what's really out there in the darkness.